lights come on, just give a warm welcome back to the pulpit to Pastor Rachel. Come on.
Hi guys, it's so great to get to be back with you. Like Pastor David said, it's been a second since I was up here to preach, but every time it's just such a joy and an honor. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to be with you here today. So one of the things that happened to me since the last time I was here is I got married to this wonderful person over here, my Maddie. He is also your online host today, so make sure you say hi to him if you're joining online in the comments. But one of the many things that I did in preparation for our wedding was looking for a wedding dress. So the first time I looked for a wedding dress, I went to the store kind of just thinking, okay, is what I think I like what I actually like? So I tried on all different kinds of styles. I even had like my best friend picked out something that was like the complete opposite of everything that I thought I would like, and I tried that one on and I was like, yep, no, I like what I thought that I liked. And so the second time that I went shopping, I went in, I was like, okay, we've like confirmed all of that. I want to find my dress. And so that day, it was just me and my mom, and I tried on probably 10 different dresses that day, and I was down to like 2 that were both pretty similar in terms of like the cut, but the styles were pretty different. So one of them was like really plain, clean. The other one was like sparkly, had like lace. They weren't super like each other in that way. And so the super plain, clean one had this like pearl veil that went with it that I just loved. And the other one had this like simpler veil. And so I went back and forth, literally was taking both of those dresses off and on and trying to like compare and see which one I liked better. And finally, my mom said, okay, well on this like clean, plain dress, the veil is the moment. And on the other dress, the dress is the moment. And she was like, you're really only gonna have the veil on for like maybe your pictures and then during the ceremony for like 20 minutes. And at that moment I was like, you're right, it clicked to me, and I picked the sparkly lace dress because I was like, I want the dress to be the moment. And so I told that whole thing to the lady that was doing my alterations. I was standing there like life-size Barbie being like the mannequin for like an hour as she like pinned and fluffed all the layers. And she asked me how I chose the dress. So I told her that whole thing, and I said, yet again, my mom was the voice of reason in my life. We've all been in situations where we needed a voice of reason. We've all been in situations that, for whatever reason, we just needed somebody else to speak into it and help us come to a point of decision or clarity. Maybe, it was a difficult decision where there was something happening that was really emotional for us. Maybe it was a situation where we were just too close to it to have good perspective. You might have been really in your head about something, and sometimes you just need somebody to cut through all those crazy swirling thoughts and bring you back to like some straight line thinking. Whatever it may be, whether it's not super often or whether it feels like it's all the time, we can probably all relate to needing a voice of reason. And as we've been talking about it, the person that is that role in your life has probably come to mind. For me, it's been my parents, it's been my close friends, it's been my sister, Matt. The person who really shows up today as a voice of reason for David, the person who really shows up to offer wisdom, is a woman named Abigail. Now, this was not planned by us, but today is the first Sunday in Women's History Month, and we happen to be talking about a woman in the Bible. And so today I just want to highlight and celebrate the role that women have played in the biblical narrative throughout all of history and in the present. And in this week's Deeper Dive, we'll talk more about that. But for now, if you'll join me in 1 Samuel 25, we'll start to learn more about Abigail and continue in our journey through David's life. 1 Samuel 25 starts out by telling us that Samuel dies, and the Israelites lament the loss of a leader. And for David, we can maybe imagine that this loss was more personal. Samuel was the person who first anointed David, and so we can imagine that it's a felt loss for him. It also signifies to us a kind of transition. Saul has publicly acknowledged that David will be the next king. Samuel passes, and while David is not king yet, this might be a different phase for him than it was before. Despite this loss, David continues on. And that's really how the kingdom of God works, right? When we experience the loss of somebody who is dedicated to the Lord and dedicated to their calling, when we lose somebody that's honorable, somebody that we look up to, it is right to lament. It is right to mourn and to grieve and to stop and feel the sadness and express the sadness. But it's also right to keep going and continue the work that God has for us to do as we're on our journey. And David does that. He keeps going. He goes to a place called Maon where there's a wealthy man called Nabal. And the passage goes on to describe Nabal as rich in terms of what he has, his possessions. But the other things that the passage says about Nabal are pretty unflattering. His name literally means fool. He's said to be a descendant of Caleb. That's not meant to be a positive thing. And it says he was mean and crude in all of his dealings. In contrast, he was married to a woman named Abigail, who's described as being beautiful and sensible. And you're thinking, okay, how on earth did these two people end up together? And in the world, though, of arranged marriages, which is likely the world that Abigail was living in, being married to somebody who was wealthy, no matter how they were actually in terms of their personality, would have been a good thing. So now we've basically met our three characters, David, who we've gotten to know pretty well, Nabal, and Abigail. So when David arrives in Maon, he finds out that Nabal is shearing his sheep. So he sends him a request for compensation, which is what you'll see in verses 6 through 8-ish. And you're like, okay, why is David asking about this? Why is he asking about this now? Well, as his request explains, David offered protection for Nabal's shepherds. So, this is a service you could charge for. It'd be like if you wanted to, if you're going to be somebody's bodyguard. Sure, you could do that out of the goodness of your heart, but you could also charge for it because it's a service. And David's asking to be compensated for this service now because it's sheep shearing time, which traditionally was a time of feasting and generosity, and Nabal would be in a good place financially, not because he wasn't normally, again, he was rich. But David makes this request kindly, sends messengers, so it's not supposed to be intimidating or anything, because, David isn't king, but he's the anointed king, and known as by a lot of people as this great and fierce guy. But Nabal receives this request, and we see what he says in 1 Samuel 25:10 through 11. Should show up on the screen here. Nabal says, "Who is this fellow David?" Nabal sneered to the young men. "Who does the son of Jesse think he is? There are lots of servants these days who run away from their masters. Should I take my bread and my water and my meat that I've slaughtered for my shearers and give it to them, to a band of outlaws who come from who knows where?" Nabal definitely knew who David was. His response is more like, "Who does this punk think he is?" and not like, "Oh, David, that name doesn't ring a bell." His response also further reveals his character and the extent of his stinginess. We know that Nabal is wealthy, and it's sheep shearing time. It's supposed to be a time of hospitality. And yet, even in this time, Nabal still says, "Mine, mine, mine." So I kind of liken a sermon to being on Kilimanjaro Safari at Disney World, where you're in the safari van and you have a safari guide, and they're kind of just pointing things out as you go along through the passage. And so I want to take a brief stop in our safari van and point something out as we're going through this passage. And I just want to stop and remind us to not fall into this Nabal way of looking at what God has given us. There isn't anything wrong with wealth or with having, but there is something wrong when you become stingy, when you focus and become greedy or are focused on self-preservation. Imagine what God could have done with Nabal if he would have simply held his wealth with open hands. All right, that's all I got there. So great Kodak moment. We're going to keep on driving through the nature preserve passage, whatever analogy you want to use. So anyhow, suffice to say, when David hears Nabal's response to his request, he is insulted. And he basically reacts and tells his men, all right, y'all, get your guns, saddle up, we're fixing to settle the score, let's go. Which seems like out of character for David, who's demonstrated a lot more patience with like Saul's antics. And there could be a couple reasons for why David suddenly seems really reactive. Like we said earlier, David's probably dealing with emotions from the passing of Samuel. A lot of us know really emotional times in life can make us maybe act a little bit differently than we normally would. He also has been having to deal with Saul for a while, and so maybe he's just a little worn thin in the area of patience. Wouldn't we all be? I mean, this is all speculation, but definitely we observe some atypical behavior from David here. Meanwhile, all this is happening. Abigail, who's Nabal's wife, is approached by a servant in the household, and they let her know what's going on between Nabal and David, that there's going to be this very extreme conflict. And Abigail recognizes that it is an extreme life or death situation, and she springs into action, gathering food and gifts to take to David, and they start off to meet him. And this part of the story is really where we got to talking about that voice of reason, wisdom, and the lessons that we can learn about that. So we'll go ahead and stop for the first one now, and that is that wisdom is responsive and not reactive. Before we dig into this too much, I want to walk through the difference between reacting and responding. So reactions are near immediate. They're typically motivated or controlled by emotion. So for example, if you walk into a surprise party, you might react with a smile, or you might gasp because you're happy and you're surprised by something that your friends did for you. Another example, you could hear some really bad news about something and you could react by crying because you're sad. So from these examples, we learned that reactions and emotions, they're not always or inherently bad. From these examples, we know that to be true, but we also know by the example that we see in this story that it can be bad to just react. In this story, David hears about Nabal's reply, and he takes action that is controlled by outrage. Responses, on the other hand, are typically a little more measured. They might be informed by emotion, but they're not motivated like solely by emotion. Because again, emotions aren't bad. They point to the truth of what's happening in us, but they just don't necessarily tell us the whole truth of what's happening in reality. So, for example, a response could be receiving an email that has some upsetting news that makes you feel some kind of way. And instead of just typing up the first things that pop in your mind and hitting send, responding could be taking a moment to process the information and sending what you think about it later when you've had time to just settle. In this story, we see Abigail act swiftly, and we do see emotion later in her conversation with David, but she acts reasonably, which points us to the fact that this is an example of responding, not just reacting. When we walk in wisdom, we'll choose to respond instead of react. Like I said earlier, emotions aren't bad. Showing emotion isn't bad, but allowing ourselves to be controlled by emotion is not wise. There's a difference. And being controlled by emotion, it often doesn't lead us to living lives that reflect Christ. And that's the true goal of believers, is to look like Jesus in how we live. Jesus had emotion, and Jesus showed emotion. Jesus wasn't void of emotion, but he wasn't controlled by it either. In this way and every other way, Jesus shows us what being human really means. You may have heard somebody say, well, I'm only human, when they're frustrated with themselves for unwise decisions or feelings or shortcomings. But the reality is that we don't need to feel limited by our humanity, nor is our humanity, even what's to blame for our shortcomings. It's not that we're human. It's that we're broken. It's not that our humanity has tainted us. It's that our humanity has been tainted by sin. Jesus shows us what being human really looks like. Adam and Eve, the first humans, they failed. But Jesus redeems the narrative, and with his life shows us all what being human can really be. Jesus was fully God, but he was also fully, completely human. And he still led a life of perfect love, perfect compassion. He lived a life that wasn't void of emotions, but it wasn't controlled by them either. Jesus lived a life marked by wisdom. In learning to be wise, we are learning to redeem our broken humanity. Like we talked about a few moments ago, in this story, David reacts in a way that points to him being controlled by his emotions. And like we'll see in a moment, taking actions that are solely dictated by how we feel in a moment can lead to consequences we didn't think about and actions that we might live to regret. This leads us into the next part of the narrative, which will then lead us to our next point about wisdom. So Abigail goes to David, and it's likely the first time he's able to really see her is face to face. And this is what happens in 1 Samuel 25, 23 through 31. When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed low before him. She fell at his feet and said, "I accept all blame in this matter, my lord. Please listen to what I have to say. I know Nabal is a wicked and ill-tempered man. Please don't pay attention to him. He is a fool, just as his name suggests. But I never even saw the young men you sent. Now, my lord, as surely as the Lord lives and you yourself live, since the Lord has kept you from murdering and taking vengeance into your own hands, let all your enemies and those who try to harm you be as cursed as Nabal is. And here is a present that I, your servant, have brought to you and your young men. Please forgive me if I've offended you in any way. The Lord will surely reward you with a lasting dynasty, for you are fighting the Lord's battles, and you have not done wrong throughout your entire life. Even when you're chased by those who seek to kill you, your life is safe in the care of the Lord your God, secure in his treasure pouch. But the lives of your enemies will disappear like stones shot from a sling. When the Lord has done all he promised and has made you leader of Israel, don't let this be a blemish on your record. Then your conscience won't have to bear the staggering burden of needless bloodshed and vengeance. And when the Lord has done these great things for you, please remember me, your servant." We see here how Abigail speaks to diffuse the situation. And part of how she does that is through offering perspective. And that's the next thing to point out about wisdom, is that wisdom requires perspective. Abigail reminds David of who God is and of who David is. She reminds David the consequences of his actions. She reminds him that he's a great man, but in following through with this action and going to attack Nabal in his house, that would be a permanent stain on his record. He would have to live with that forever. And Abigail makes this appeal banking on the fact that based on David's character, that's not something that he would be okay with. You can probably think of a time when you've seen something like this in a movie, right? Like the villain character does something to really mess with the hero character, so the hero is like ready to have their vengeance, and the hero's best friend or sidekick or whoever shows up and says, "No, you're the hero. Heroes don't act like this. What are you doing? Stop." And the hero, you kind of see, gets this like knowing look on their face, and they're like, "You're right," still mad, but puts the sword away or whatever. And we move on with the plot of the film. I just watched the Lord of the Rings movies for the first time a couple weeks ago, and so the example that I thought of when I was thinking about this was Frodo Baggins and Samwise Gamgee. Frodo is like the kind of protagonist hero figure, and Sam is like his best friend, sidekick person. But even Frodo, who is this noble person like David, has the temptation to give up and give in to evil. And when that happens, Sam is really the person beside him that's keeping things on track and keeping the mission central. And that's really what Abigail does as well. She helps David regain some perspective and clarity. When we are deep in a situation, when we're filled with emotion, it can cause things to get a little bit foggy sometimes. It can cause us to not think so clearly. Wisdom requires perspective, and in this case, it came from another person intervening. And sometimes we need that too. We need another person to step in and remind us that this is who God is, and this is who we are. We need another person to remind us where the path we are on leads to. We need somebody to tell us, this is where you're going to get up if you continue acting this way. We need to be told the consequences of our actions to get us to snap back into focus. And sometimes we need to try to get some perspective ourselves by taking a step back from a situation and just settling before we keep going on any further. It's like the thing with the email, right? Sometimes you got to step back and just let things settle. Matt is really good at this. If we're having a conversation and he senses that he's going to say something that's more hurtful than it is helpful, he will stop and take a step back and settle before he says anything else. He stops to respond and not to react. And in that way, we see how these two pieces work together. When someone offers perspective and wisdom, or we choose to take perspective in wisdom, it helps us to pause and respond instead of react. Or it helps us to stop the reaction and start responding instead. Abigail helps David think through the consequences of his actions. And in this case, something that seems really simple, like just stopping to take some perspective and think about how this is going to play out, becomes life-saving. Abigail's perspective saves David from taking actions he would probably regret and spares Nabal and his house from David and his men. Now, you may have noticed as we've been walking through this story and these course of events, Abigail, who's kind of like the heroine of this interaction, and the primary things we've been learning from, also kind of seemingly goes behind her husband's back to figure something out, and then she talks trash about him to somebody else. So these aren't necessarily advisable things to do, but you gotta, okay. Nabal, he would not be reasoned with. He would not be reasoned with. And so while those aren't necessarily advisable, it's also not advisable to follow somebody down the path of foolishness, even if that person is someone you respect or is an authority figure. The last thing we learn about wisdom from this interaction is that sometimes wisdom requires bravery. Our parents, our teachers, our bosses, our colleagues, our spouses, those are people that are worthy of our respect. But if somebody is going down the path of foolishness and they will not be reasoned with, if someone is going down the path of foolishness and there are only negative consequences for everybody involved, we have to find the courage to speak up, or to say or to do something to shift the narrative. When I was writing this, I was reminded of this episode from one of my favorite shows, Madam Secretary. I feel like I talk about it every time I'm here, but it's just a good show. And in this episode, the president is just exhibiting this crazy erratic behavior that is not based in any reason, akin to foolishness, if you will. And some of the president's closest advisors have to make the decision whether to vote to remove him from office. Can you imagine your boss is one of the most powerful and respected people in the entire world, and you have to raise your hand and say, yeah, I don't think that they're fit to lead. Like a lot of things, speaking up against foolishness or taking action against foolishness seems obvious and easy, yep, that's definitely the right thing to do. But it can be really difficult. It can require risk, because even when we know, when we're convicted that this is the right thing and we do the right thing, there can be unknown or negative consequences. And it doesn't just require bravery to speak up or act in wisdom. Sometimes it takes a different kind of courage, a humility, to stop and receive or heed the wisdom of somebody else. David did not have to listen to Abigail. He could have written her off. He could have justified his anger in a multitude of ways. People probably wouldn't have asked very many questions if David just ignored her plea. He was heroic. People liked him. He was the anointed king. But David stops, and he listens, and he allows Abigail to impact him. He doesn't just hear her, he listens to her. It can be easy when you have authority to convince yourself that what you believe is the right path is the right path. It can be easy to feel like your feelings or perspective on something are the only ones there are, or the only ones that matter. But David doesn't do that. He listens. Wisdom listens. It can require bravery, it takes perspective, it's responsive, and it's not reactive. These are all truths that we can take from this passage. But as we start to come to the close of our time together today, I want to shift focus a little. In David's story, all this time that we've been going through this series, we've seen different shadows and parallels to Jesus and the gospel message, and I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the ones that we see here. I read this article earlier this week by Nana Dolce. I'm unsure if I'm saying that right, so sorry. You're probably not watching this, but sorry. But it gave me some really good perspective on this narrative. Wisdom was something that David needed as king, and it's something that we need in our lives today. That's why we spent all this time talking about it. But the stories in the Bible and the story of the Bible is so much more than just models of how to be a good person. The Bible is about way more than just being a good person. Yeah, the Bible does show us best practice for how to live life. Again, that's why we spent the last 30 minutes talking about wisdom, but the biblical narrative is about way more than just behavior. The whole thing is about Jesus and the redemption story that God is writing. You may know this about the Bible and you might not, but when you pick it up, there are all these books and chapters and all these stories about people, right? And some of them go together and some of them don't really seem like they go together at all. There's narrative and poetry and prophecy, and it might seem like the Bible is just like an anthology, a book of compiled, like recommended readings. Like, okay, when I was in elementary school and middle school, we had these giant language arts textbooks, right? And they were filled with all these stories. It was like, here you might have a story about lions from National Geographic. And then over here, there was like a biography on Eleanor Roosevelt. Those things don't really go together, but they were in the same book. The Bible isn't really like that. All the stories come together to tell one big story. There is a narrative that underpins all of the other ones. And that is the story of how we were created and separated from God through sin, and God's mission to redeem us and the world through his son, Jesus. The whole Bible tells this story, and there's glimpses of this message everywhere. In today's story, we see that not only is Abigail wise, but she is willing to lay down her life to reconcile these two men. She was an unarmed woman who raced to meet David's army, and she was willing to lay down her life for there to be a mended relationship. Not like, David and Nabal are best friends now, because that doesn't happen. If you read the rest of chapter 25, you know that that's not what happens. But there's a peace in their relationship. David isn't seeking bloodshed anymore. And that's what Jesus does. Jesus lays down his life for the sake of reconciliation, for the sake of mended relationship. When we, as in we human people, chose sin, we put a distance between ourselves and God. And it wasn't until Jesus came and paid the price for human sin on the cross that that distance could go away, that we could have a chance at mended relationship with God, that the gap was closed, that we could be reconciled. I'm not sure where you're at in your journey with Jesus. I'm not sure if what I just said is something you've heard a bunch of different ways, a bunch of different times, or if this is the first time you're really hearing about Jesus. Maybe today, that's the thing that you need most, is to say yes to a relationship with somebody who laid down their life to reconcile you to your Heavenly Father. Or maybe today the thing that you need most is to apply one of the principles we walked through on wisdom. Maybe you relate to David, and in this instance you find that you're reactive sometimes, or you need to do more perspective taking. Maybe you need to humble yourself like David did and heed some wisdom. And maybe your next step, maybe the thing that you need most is to be brave and use your voice. That is what Abigail had to do. She saw that these men were on the path of foolishness, and she stepped up to do something about it, even though she was not probably the likely choice of somebody to do something about it. And she probably didn't know how exactly it was going to end for her. In a moment, those 3 points are going to appear on the screen. And when they do, I'm going to read through them, as well as let you know what the challenge is going to be for this week. After we do all of that, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and show which number most closely relates to where you're at, and then we're going to pray. So here's those 3 points on the screen. The first one is, I need Jesus. The second one is, I need to gain perspective and be more responsive, / I need to heed wisdom. And then the third one is, I need to use my voice to offer wisdom. And my challenge to you this week is twofold. The first one is, tell somebody around you which number you held up and what you're going to do